All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It is straight up 1:30. It looks like we have a quorum. We have City of Modesto, City of Waterford, Stanislaus County, Oakdale Irrigation District, and Modesto Irrigation District. So again, good afternoon and welcome to the March meeting of the Stanislaus and Tuolumne Rivers Groundwater Basin Association Groundwater Sustainability Agency. At times, I think I should have listened to Walt, and we should have embraced a different name than we did, because it is always a mouthful. So anyway, good afternoon again. Do we have any public comment this afternoon? Okay, seeing none, let's move to item number 3 on the agenda, which is consideration of our February 10th, 2021 meeting minutes. And I'll entertain a motion to approve those minutes.
Make that motion.
Thank you, Walt. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Thank you, Eric. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Anybody opposed? Thank you. The motion's carried. The minutes are approved. Gordon, you are up on the budget and schedule, please.
Hey, good afternoon. I don't know if I need to share my screen. I think everybody has the handout. But so far, we're about 51% of we've spent about 51% of the budget, and we've used about 2/3 of the time, about 66% of the time. So anyway, we're moving ahead. I think we're 2/3 of the way through as far as schedule goes, and about halfway through on the spend rate. So I don't know if anybody has any questions, but I'd be happy to take any.
Are there any questions for Gordon? All right, Gordon, you lucked out. I don't see any questions. Thank you for the update. If you want to stay on, Gordon, and I'll kick to you for at least your part of item number 5, the public outreach update.
Yes, and hopefully Sam will jump in whatever she wants to. So we met with Stantec, our consultant who is the consultant through the facility support services contract with DWR. And as we talked about at the last meeting, we approved a near-term public outreach activities. So we solicited some volunteers for our office hour sessions, as well as the pre-recorded. We're doing some pre-recorded sessions dealing with different Sigma topics. And Walt and Miguel have agreed to sit on the office hours session. Our first one is scheduled for March 25th from 12 to 1. And that will be, we'll be sending out a flyer and with a Zoom meeting announcement, as well as I think on Constant Contact. The pre-recorded sessions so far, Eric and Miguel have volunteered for that session, and those will be hopefully taking place. Stantec's working on the templates and putting together some of the talking points, and hopefully that'll happen the 3rd or 4th week of March. We also are planning a second office hour session, depending on how the first one goes. So if it goes well and we get a lot of response, we'll go ahead and schedule a second session of office hours, and Eric and Michael Renfro have volunteered to host those. The only other thing is we've also, Stantec is also putting together a kind of a slide deck and talking points, so that if anyone would like to go out, and hopefully people will go out, or representatives will go out and meet with their own constituencies, they can give a presentation on what we're doing here at STRGBA, as well as what are the sustainable management criteria and other issues that we're facing. So that'll be coming out also in the next week or two. And that's all I had, unless Sam would like to add anything.
Nope, I think you've covered it all. We have lots of stuff coming up, so we appreciate everybody volunteering, and hope that we get good outreach and opportunities for people to weigh in.
Hey, Sam, any idea when that flyer might be ready for distribution?
Yes, it's my plan to have it ready to go by tomorrow. So
Okay.
Just making a few final touches on it, and it should be ready to go. And we'll have it in a couple different ways for people to share, whether that's Constant Contact or social media, or just a flyer PDF to email out.
Will it be bilingual?
I can get it bilingual. I don't know if I'll have it ready to be bilingual tomorrow, but we can definitely work on that.
Hey, Miguel, don't you think that'd be a good idea?
Well, while Miguel's thinking, I think that probably makes some sense.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'll get what I have out to you guys. And as soon as we have a bilingual version, I can send that along as well.
Very good. Well, I too appreciate folks stepping up and volunteering for the office hours and or the pre-recorded sessions. I'm also happy to help Gordon, but I've said before, I wanted this to be a group effort. So to the extent you have holes that need to be plugged, you can look me up as well. I'm happy to help. So again, thank you to those member agencies and individuals that have stepped up thus far. Anything else, Gordon, Sam?
Nothing from me. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you both. Let's move to item number 6, which is the quick update on the GSP. Phyllis is not with us today, but we are in the capable hands of Liz. So Liz, we'll turn it over to you.
Hello. Yeah, so as far as the GSP, we are working on 2 things now. One is the modeling and the other is sustainable management criteria. For the modeling, the team at Woodard and Kern is working on both climate change scenario and the sustainable yield run, which is the demand reduction run. And as far as sustainable management criteria, today at the TAC meeting, I'll be discussing the chronic lowering of water levels. But over the next couple months, the sustainable management criteria is going to be a focus of a lot of our TAC meetings and a lot of our work. We're hoping that by the end of May, we have made decisions on sustainable management criteria and then can move on to projects and management actions.
Very good. Thank you for that. Of course, the majority of our discussion today, as you alluded to, is going to happen in the TAC meeting. So keep those vocal cords ready because you'll be up here before long. Item number 7, Liz and Miguel, a monitoring well update. I know we have some drilling going on in the basin. So tell us what's happened.
Yeah, it's going very smoothly. Today we are finishing up the 4th well. We've drilled the 4 wells that are in the eastern subbasin, which are locations 7, 8, 9, and 10. It's going very smoothly. The driller has been great, hasn't had any, knock on wood, equipment problems. And next week, they work on a 10-day on and 4-day off schedule. So today they're finishing the well at location number 9, which is the one near MID Canal. And then they'll be off for 4 days and then start again next week. And they are going to start next week in Waterford and then move to a location in Modesto. So it's moving along really well.
Yeah.
And since we have Mike on the phone, we send out notification, mailed it to the residents out there. We mailed it out so that they can receive it on Thursday or Friday. So they'll be getting it 4 to 5 days prior to work commencing.
Thank you, Miguel. Appreciate it. Sorry I'm late, everybody.
Not a problem at all. Welcome. And just a quick update for the benefit of the public, I suppose, and just to make sure that there's consensus amongst all the member agencies. It sounds like there is, in fact, consensus, and that is that the wells that we will are drilling and will be drilling will be owned by the GSA itself. And I think that's the right thing to do from my perspective. So again, just a recognition that I think that's where we landed, and the semantics behind making that happen are yet to be determined, but we'll be working on that over the course of the next couple weeks. Okay. Okay. Thank you for the update. Anything else, Liz, Miguel? Okay, good. Our next meeting for the Stanislaus and Tuolumne Rivers Groundwater Basin Association GSA is scheduled for April the 14th at 1:30 p.m. And let's go ahead and are there, before we adjourn, any items too late for the agenda for our regular GSA meeting? Okay, seeing none, let's adjourn our regular meeting and move into our Technical Advisory Committee meeting. We'll start the meeting off. Is there any public comment today? Okay, doesn't look like there is. Item number 3 is consideration of our February 10th, 2021 meeting minutes. And I'll entertain a motion to approve those minutes.
Renfro makes motion.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Thank you, Walt. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Great, thank you. The motion's carried and the minutes are approved. Item number 4, an update from you, Liz, on the sustainable management criteria, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I will share my screen because I have a presentation to go through. Can you see the presentation? All right, great.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining. So today we're going to be talking about sustainable management criteria. And specifically, we're going to be continuing our discussion on the chronic lowering of water levels sustainability indicator. And there are 3 parts to this presentation. The first is we're going to discuss whether or not there have been any adverse impacts to wells during the recent drought. Then we're going to talk about an analysis we did about the domestic well vulnerability. And then we're going to talk about selecting minimum thresholds. We're not going to be selecting minimum thresholds today, but we're just going to start talking about how we can do that in the future over the next, by the end of May. So were there adverse impacts from declining water levels? The question is, during the recent drought, did we have dry wells, operational issues, or water quality concerns? And so during the last TAC meeting, we requested feedback from the TAC members on whether or not they knew of any adverse impacts to their wells. Specifically, we asked if there were adverse impacts with water supply wells during the recent drought between 2013 and 2016, or during recent years since 2016. Specifically, we wanted to know what type of well was impacted, how it may have occurred, how old the wells were, how deep they were, where was the screen interval, what happened, what was the nature of the impact, were these impacts caused or exacerbated by declining water levels, and what actions were taken to either manage or mitigate the impacts. And then we also asked, whether or not that well was still operational today, was it still active? And then in the future, whether these impacts can be readily managed or mitigated during a future drought. And we got feedback from all of the member agencies. And so I'll go through a few slides that summarize that feedback that we got. So several TAC members reported that there were no adverse impacts to water supply wells during the recent drought. And this included the city of Oakdale, Riverbank, as well as Modesto Irrigation District. And MID noted that groundwater levels have partially recovered since the drought because of the decreased pumping demand. City of Modesto. City of Modesto said that the surface water supplies decreased during the drought and groundwater pumping increased, but no wells went dry during the drought. And there were also no significant water quality concerns, although there were some water quality problems, but they weren't huge concerns. And City of Modesto said there's potential for water quality problems during a longer drought in the future. The city of Waterford reported that water levels dropped about 20 feet between 2005 and 2015. And they had problems with 2 different wells. Well, 242, they had to replace the pump and lower it about 20 feet in 2015. This well was about 300 feet deep, constructed in the 1940s and rehabbed in the 1980s. And because of the replacement and lowering, it's operational today. They also had a problem with well 245, where the casing collapsed because the water levels lowered during the drought in 2015. The depth of the casing of this well was about 120 feet. It had an open borehole to about 200 feet, and it was constructed in the late 60s. But because of the casing collapse, sand was introduced into the well. And so residents had sand in their water, which damaged appliances, fixtures, and sprinkler systems. And the well had to be taken offline. And this was a loss for the city because it previously had high production and good water quality. And the city is also concerned that similar problems may occur again in the future if another similar drought occurs. And so there's a need for new, deeper wells. Oakdale Irrigation District reported a similar water level drop on average of about 20 feet between 2005 to 2020. in their main service area, but even steeper declines in the eastern OID boundaries of about 53 feet. And since the drought, since 2016, water levels have continued to drop. They've dropped about 1.3 feet per year in the main service area and between 2 and 4 feet per year in the eastern OID. And just in the last 6 months, OID has had to pull and replace or extend pumps in 4 wells, 3 of which were in the Modesto subbasin. These wells were drilled between about 1945 and 1987. They also have several landowners who have had issues with water levels dropping below their pump setting or the bottom of their domestic well. The wells went dry. And they see that there's potential for domestic wells in the eastern OID service areas to become dry if water levels continue to drop in the future. Stanislaus County. So the county doesn't own or operate groundwater facilities, but during the drought between 2014 and 17, domestic well owners reported water supply problems to the county. Problems were reported for about 160 domestic wells in the basin. Most were shallow and old, over 50 years old and less than 100 feet deep. And the county assisted these well owners with storage tanks and new well installations throughout their dry well program. The subbasin also sent out, or the GSA also sent out a stakeholder survey. And there were lots of different questions on the survey, as you probably know. One of them had to do with lowering of water levels and adverse impacts. And there were 13 respondents, 4 of which indicated that they saw a 10-foot per year reduction in water levels in wells during the recent drought. And 12 respondents discussed what happened, and 10 of them did not experience any operational issues or well problems during the drought. 1 experienced water quality changes, and 1 experienced water level decline below the pump or the well. The well went dry. So we did a domestic well analysis for wells, new wells that were constructed since the drought, since 2015. We looked at DWR's well construction database, and we pulled all the records for wells that were constructed since 2015. And we focused on the domestic wells. There were over 211 to be exact, domestic wells that were drilled since 2015. And that's what this map is showing. Likely, these wells were replacement wells for previously failed wells, but we don't know for sure that that's true, but likely they were. And this map shows those well locations, and they're color-coded according to how deep they were constructed. The red is our wells, red dots are wells that were drilled over 400 feet deep, orange between 300 and 400 feet deep, yellow between 200 and 300, green between 100 and 200, blue less than 100 feet. And there were some wells where DWR did not have construction information. Those are the gray dots. And you can see, just sort of looking at the map, stepping back and looking at it, that you see a lot of green wells in the west. Those are some of the shallower wells, and some blue. And as you move to the east, the wells, you see more yellows and oranges and reds. Those are the deeper wells. 75% of the wells where we know the construction were drilled over 200 feet deep. And those are the yellow, the orange, and the red dots. So the question we asked was, would these new domestic wells be vulnerable to failure if water levels decline below their historic lows from the drought? And throughout most of the subbasin, historic lows were reached during the recent drought. But you'll see it, in subsequent slides in this presentation, that in some cases, historic lows, especially around the city of Modesto, were reached in the early 1990s. But for most of the subbasin, historic lows were reached in the recent drought. So this map shows the groundwater elevation contours based on water levels that were measured in October 2015. And this map was in our GSP. And so what we did was we developed a GIS raster from these groundwater elevation contours. And a raster is just a continuous surface. So we took these contour lines and turned it into a continuous surface of groundwater elevations, which is, approximates groundwater elevations between the contour lines. And then once we had this continuous surface, we subtracted that surface from the ground surface elevation to look at depth to water. And that's what this map is showing. So this is a continuous surface of depth to water. And the blue colors, the darker blues are shallow. And as the blues get lighter, they get deeper. And then in the deeper depths to water, the deepest depths to water are in the greens and yellows. And I'll just use my cursor here. John, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my cursor? No, you can. Okay, thank you. So in general, and this is not a surprise to anybody, but the shallowest groundwater in the subbasin is in the western subbasin and also along the river boundaries, and that's where you see the blues. And the deepest groundwater is in the eastern subbasin, where you see the greens and the yellows. So in the very western subbasin, depth to water was very shallow during the recent drought, less than 20 feet. And as you move east, it gets deeper. So here's between 20 and 40 feet, between 40 and 60 feet, between 60 and 80, between 80 and 100. And then in the east here, it's over 100 feet deep. So then we overlaid all of the new domestic wells onto the depth to water map. And we asked, how far below the water table are these new domestic wells? In other words, how much would water levels have to drop for these new wells to go dry? And we used the bottom of the screen or the bottom of the well if DWR didn't have screen information. And so these are the same domestic wells that you saw a couple slides ago, and these are now color coded according to how far below the water table they were constructed. So the purple dots are the deepest. They were, or not necessarily the deepest, but the furthest below the water table. They were over 200 feet below the water table. The blue wells are between 100 and 200 feet below the water table. Greens between 50 and 100, and the yellows, the shallowest or the least depth below the water table, between 0 and 50. There are a couple of wells, 2 pink wells that are colored right here, where when we did this analysis, we saw that the depth to water was actually slightly below the bottom of the well. And both of these cases, the well was about 57 or 58 feet deep, and the water depth to water was around 60 or 62, somewhere in there. It was off by about 5 feet. And the reason for that is because, like I said earlier, the raster is not exact. We're taking contours that are based on measured data, and we're sort of filling them in between. And so they're not exact. And so we would expect, some slight error. But the important thing is that these pink wells were constructed not too far below the water table. And so they're more vulnerable than others. But what we saw when we did this was that most of the wells, 87% of the wells that had construction information, were constructed at least 100 feet below the water table. And those are the blue and the purple dots. And just a few, 8 wells, 4% of the wells with known construction, are less than 50 feet below the water table. And those are the green, the yellow, and the pink dots. So what we learned from this is that based on the screen and the well depths, most of the new domestic wells that were constructed since 2015 may be able to tolerate future water level declines up to about 50 feet, and they won't go dry. The most vulnerable wells are in the east central subbasin along the river boundaries, and I circled sort of where those are. So in this area, kind of around Waterford, and in this area, kind of between Riverbank and including Oakdale. And in these areas, you see some more brightly colored dots, like the yellow dots, where the well depth is, or the well is only between 0 and 50 feet below the water table. And some green also here, where the well is only 50 to 100 feet below the water table. So these wells, we think, are the most vulnerable to future water level declines. We do see green dots in the western subbasin where it's between 50 and 100 feet below the water table. But based on historical water levels and trends, we wouldn't expect that water levels in the future would decline 50 feet in the west. So we don't think these are as vulnerable. So does anybody have any questions about that?
Thank you, Liz. I have a couple questions, but I'll save those until we get some feedback from others to the extent there is any. Let's start with the member agencies. Are there questions for Liz on what she's covered so far? Okay. Any questions from the public? Okay, Steve Cannell with Oakdale Irrigation District has a question. Go ahead, Steve. Steve, I think you have to unmute yourself. You should be able to talk. There you go.
Technology's killing me, John. Liz, how many domestic wells are in the county? I mean, this is a representative sample of those that have been replaced, likely because of falling water tables, but how many more domestic wells are there in the county that may still be at risk?
It's a good question. I don't remember the number. Let's see. I think that we looked at records of domestic wells. I want to say hundreds and hundreds, 600 to 800, somewhere in that range. But that needs to be qualified because these are domestic wells that have been constructed at any point in time that GWR has a record of, right? We don't know if of those wells, we don't know which ones are active today. But you make a good point. There are domestic wells that are older than these because these are only the wells that are constructed since 2015 that are vulnerable. And, in previous TAC meetings, we've looked at the locations of the wells that had gone dry or had problems that were reported to the county. And I want to say there were, I forget the exact number, but on the order of 150 to 170, somewhere in there, that had problems during the drought. And we think that these were probably, by and large, replacements for those. But there are other wells, obviously, that may not have had problems during that drought that could have problems in the future. And so we don't know exactly how many older wells, older than 2015, are vulnerable because we were focusing on the newest ones here.
So I actually have a question that is kind of in the same vein as Steve's question, and that is your characterization of this analysis was of sort of new wells, but under the context that they were replacement for wells that have failed. Do we know that definitively, or could they be new wells for new construction? Let's say I go out and buy a 10-acre ranchette and I'm going to put a domestic well in that wasn't there before. Do we know the difference? I don't know that it matters, practically speaking. Do we know the difference between a new construction and a replacement?
No, we don't. So you're right. I'm sure that there are new wells that are not replacement wells. But just looking, but the reason that we say we think that a lot of these probably are replacement wells is the pattern of where these new wells are is similar to the pattern of the wells that failed that were reported to the county. But surely there are wells that were constructed since 2015 that were not replacement, that are, like you said, new developments, new properties, new homes, etc.
And then just taking Steve's question maybe one step further, and maybe this is what he was getting at, is would it be of value for us to look at, sort of a broader picture of domestic wells that are out there rather than just the new ones, to see if there are other wells that are susceptible to declining groundwater levels in other places? Sure,
of course, we can do that. Now that we've got this depth to water raster, we can look at all of the records of domestic wells that DWR has and look at where those depths are in relation to the depth of water. So yeah, we can do that. our focus here was on the newer wells because we wanted to ask ourselves, you know, we just, you know, since the drought, we saw that this was sort of a remedy for a lot of the wells that had gone dry. A lot of the wells had been replaced. It seemed to have been replaced. And so we just wanted to see how vulnerable these new wells were to future changes in water levels.
Sure.
But yeah, we can look back. We certainly can.
Sure, understood. And then I don't see any other questions from the public at this point, so I'll ask one more. And this is a question for Steve and or Eric. So in the OID slide that discussed impact, my recollection is that there were 4 wells that were recently replaced. And so the question is this, I mean, if you looked at the age of those wells, I think they dated back to 1947, if I remember what was on the slide correctly. So are those normal life cycle replacement projects, or were those replacements exacerbated by declining groundwater levels?
Those are actually pumps that were replaced or lowered.
Got it. Okay.
So it wasn't a well that was what was replaced, and it was because of dropping water levels.
Got it. Thank you, Eric.
Okay.
Any other questions for Liz before we move forward in the presentation? Okay, Liz, I don't see any hands up, and no member agencies are talking, so go ahead, please.
And, you know, feel free also, I should have said this at the beginning, but feel free to shout out and interrupt me if you have questions about specific slides that I'm on. So the next part of this discussion is going to be about minimum threshold designations. And so again, we're not picking minimum thresholds today for water levels. We're just talking about how they can be picked, and we wanted to get the group starting to think about how we're going to pick them and what wells to use to pick them. And then using those wells, you know, how do you actually pick them from the water levels that you're seeing? So in terms of selecting representative wells, there's some key criteria to use for wells in order to pick minimum threshold designations. The first, and I think one of the most important things, is access. We want to be able to pick a well that we're going to be able to access in the future and continue to measure water levels, because if we can't, it doesn't do us a whole lot of good. Ideally, we'd like wells that have good historical water level records and known construction data, so we know which aquifer it's in if it's within the Corcoran clay extent. We'd like wells that are kind of distributed throughout the subbasin, especially in areas where we've seen water level decline. And ideally, we'd like dedicated monitoring wells or inactive production wells. And that's one of the reasons why we're conducting the project that we're doing right now, where we're installing monitoring wells throughout the subbasin. And then there's some considerations for water level records. We'd prefer, obviously, a complete historical study period record from 1991 to present. If we can't have that, if wells don't have that, well, it's helpful to have water level record during the recent drought and where we had historical low levels between 2013 and 2019. At a minimum, if we don't have that, it'd be helpful to have water levels during historical wet years like 2005 and 11, and during a couple of years of the most recent drought. It's kind of the worst years, 2014 and 2015. So here's a map of the current CASGEM monitoring network. This subbasin has a really, really good CASGEM monitoring program. There are 54 wells. Water levels are measured twice a year, and they've got very good historical data. And so we think this is a really good starting point for looking at historical water levels and for considering the wells that we use for developing MTs. And so this map shows where all the CASGEM wells are, and they're color coded according to where they're screened, what aquifer they're screened in. So the green wells are screened above the Corcoran in the western upper principal aquifer. There are a few blue wells in the west that are screened, that have long screens, and they're screened both above and below the Corcoran. So they're in the western upper and western lower principal aquifers. And then all the wells that are east of the Corcoran clay extent are in the eastern principal aquifer. And you can just see, looking at this map, that there are two big data gaps. One is in the western lower principal aquifer. The CASGEM network doesn't have wells that are screened only below the Corcoran clay. And also in the very eastern subbasin, we have a couple wells just north of the Modesto Reservoir, the 2 Pulso wells, which are extremely helpful. But other than that, there's not a whole lot in the very eastern part of the subbasin. And that's one of the reasons, again, that we are working on the monitoring well project here, where we're going to be installing 16 wells throughout the subbasin, 4 of which are in the east, and those are the ones that we've just completed. So I'm going to go through hydrographs for kind of a subset of these CASGEM wells. They're going to be hydrographs for wells that are screened above the Corcoran, wells that are screened both above and below, and wells that are screened to the east. This first group of hydrographs are all within the Corcoran clay extent, and they all are similarly formatted. The y-axis goes from 0 to 100. I'm saying this just so you know, so you can sort of compare ground surface elevations and water levels as I flip through these slides. And each of these hydrographs will show the ground surface elevation, which is this black line, the water levels, and an example MT, an MT that we may choose, or just to start kind of thinking about it. So this first, and then of course this map here shows the location of the well. This red dot you'll see is where the well is, and that will move around as I flip through the slides. So this first well is in the western upper principal aquifer, screened shallow between 40 and 75 feet. It's the Canfield 90 well. And you can see water levels are pretty stable, between 30 and 40 feet since the early 90s. The lowest water level during the study period was from the early 90s, but it's very similar to what we saw during the recent drought. And so this example MT that I've added to this slide is right at the historic low from the early 90s. The second well is the Philbrick 201 CASGEM well. This is right next to the river, and it's screened again in the western upper principal aquifer from 58 to 74 feet. You can see, looking at the water levels, that the lowest levels were in the mid-1990s, and you'll see this pattern for several of the wells that are near the city of Modesto. Water levels around the city of Modesto were pretty low in the early 90s, and then they rebounded when the city started receiving surface water in the mid-90s and started pumping less groundwater. So that's what we're seeing here. And then, during the recent drought, we saw some declines, but then it was recovered pretty quickly. So the historic low here, where I've set the potential MP, example MT, was before the city of Modesto began receiving surface water in the early 90s. And, we talked about earlier, what were the adverse impacts to wells during the recent drought? Well, another question is, were there adverse impacts to wells in the mid-1990s, when water levels were at their lowest here? And I don't know the answer to that question. This next well is also screened above the Corcoran from 53 to 81 feet. It's the North Ave 103 well, CASGEM well. And it's has a similar pattern to the last well we looked at. It's right on the edge of the city of Modesto. Historic low water levels happened in the early 1990s, and pretty stable between 50 and 60 feet after that kind of rise until the recent drought, where it dipped a little bit below 50 and then has recovered. So again, the MT, do we set it at the historic lows at the early 90s? That's something to consider. So the next couple of wells are wells that were screened, that CASGEM wells that are screened, have long screens, and they're screened both above and below the Corcoran. So they're in the western upper and the western lower principal aquifers. This is the Vosti 45 well, screened from 146 to 246. And you can see kind of through time, you can see the pumping variations up and down, up and down. And this is pretty pretty recognizable pattern for wells that are screened below the Corcoran, where a lot of the pumping is happening. And so this pattern is maybe more indicative of what's happening below the Corcoran than above. But you can see that the water levels declined. The lowest water levels were measured during the recent drought, where they declined about 20, a little more than 20 feet. And it looks like they have mostly recovered. It's not maybe quite as, the water level recently is not quite as high as it was like in 2012, but it's pretty close. So the example MT here is set at the historic low that was measured during the recent drought. This next well is the Adair 1 well, also screened above and below the Corcoran from a depth of 152 to 242. Similar pattern to the last one that we saw, where you have relatively stable but fluctuating water levels until the recent drought, and then a pretty big drop over 20 feet, 25, maybe close to 30 feet here. And then it's recovered partially since the drought. And again, this pattern, this pumping, seasonal pumping pattern is more indicative of kind of a lower aquifer response. So here the MT is being set at the historic low during the drought. This is the McDonald well on the edge of the city of Modesto, screened from 152 to 364, both above and below the Corcoran, mostly below. And this has similar pattern to the other wells that we've seen that are close to the city, where lowest water levels were in the early 90s, recovered fairly stable from the late 90s until 2012-ish, and then dropped during the drought. And you see a partial recovery here. Again, you're seeing the effect of pumping, probably City of Modesto pumping in these ups and downs. And you're seeing the effect of the city receiving surface water in the mid-90s and pumping less groundwater. So the MT here, MT here is set at historic low, which is actually about the same during the recent drought and in the early 90s before they received surface water. So now we're moving to the eastern subbasin. We've got 5 wells here with hydrographs. And for the rest of these hydrographs, you'll see the y-axis changed a little bit. Each of these will be from 0 to 250 feet to accommodate the water levels and the ground surface elevations. And this one is the Cavill 214 well. It is right outside of Riverbank and screened from 107 to 275. You can see the water levels throughout the study period were relatively stable until the drought, where they declined 20, 30 feet-ish and partial recovery. And the example MT here is set at the historic low that we saw during the recent drought. And moving to the south a little bit, between Modesto and Waterford, is the Albers 232 well, screened from about 200 to 288. Similar pattern, relatively stable groundwater levels throughout the study period from 1990 to about 2012, 2013, and then a drop of about 20 feet and a recovery of about 10, slightly less since the drought. Moving to the Jones WID 228, which is either in or very close to Waterford. Its screen is from about 188 to 280. Again, relatively stable through time, slightly declining through time since about, early 2000s, but really reaching their low during the recent drought in 2015 with some recovery, but not full recovery. And then in the center of the subbasin in the east, we've got the Furtado OID 7 well. This well is screened from about 200 to 580. We don't have much historical data. Water levels were first measured in 2012. I think that's maybe when this well was constructed. Since the drought, since 2015, water levels have continued to decline. So, I put the example MT here at the historic low that we've seen, or the recent low that we've seen. But then the question is this, do we have enough data to set an MT here? We don't know if water levels are going to flatten out and stabilize. We do know that probably the historic low didn't happen before 2012. So we probably have enough data to know that we did not reach the historic low before 2012. But the question is, what's going to happen in the future? And if you set the MT at this height, this elevation, there's a chance that very quickly you could exceed it. And the last hydrograph is for the Paul Cell 2 well. This is just north of the Modesto Reservoir, screened between 160 and 815. And we have water level data that extends back to about 2004, 2005. And we can see just how much water levels have declined in the east. And this is just shows that water levels since about 2006 have declined about more than 40 feet, close to 50 feet. And so, the question is, how do you set an MT here? If you set it at the lowest level you've seen, which is recent, there's a risk of exceeding that very quickly. So we may want to give ourselves a buffer in the future if we think that it's going to continue to decline. Does anybody have any questions on any of those hydrographs?
Any questions for Liz? We'll start with member agencies, and then it looks like we do have one hand up from the public. Let's start with member agencies. Walt?
Yeah, it's not so much a question. It's maybe just a comment, or it's just a point of discussion. It seems that this approach is, I keep thinking of is the glass half full or half empty? So if it's a half empty approach, we're sort of relying on measuring depth to water and looking at declines over time. What I wonder, and it's kind of just a different way of looking at the same thing, how does that decline reflect in terms of reducing saturated thickness of available aquifer? In other words, if we have an 800-foot thick aquifer of fresh water, and around 800 feet, and that's not uniform across the basin, but for discussion points, say it's 800. And we're talking about, in this particular well, Paul Cell, a 50-foot drawdown. 50 feet out of 800 translates to some percent of a glass still being quite full, right? Mm-hmm. Or are we saying, well, we might have 800 feet, but certainly not all that's available. We know that. Maybe we want to preserve at all times at least 75% of a full aquifer. Well, 75% of 800 is 600. Depth of water would then be dependent upon topography. You know what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I've always wondered about that. I mean, are we trying to preserve well, again, it's half full glass or half empty glass? And
But Liz, I do want you to answer, but before you do, let me just try to put it in a way that I understand it and make sure that I'm understanding Walt correctly. So Walt, are you asking the question, perhaps, I won't say arguing for, but raising the question of whether or not the minimum threshold should be less than either the drought in the 90s, as occurs in many of these figures, or less than the historic lows in the more recent drought in 2015, 2016?
What do you mean less? Shallower or deeper?
That the minimum threshold should be below the lows that we saw in either the early 90s.
And I guess I am. Here's what I'm saying. we are trying to put together a sustainability plan for not just us, but for future generations. And maybe in the past, we haven't managed the groundwater in a way that we should or could or can. And maybe we are protecting some of these shallow, inefficient domestic facilities for the wrong reason. We should be protecting the resource so that it is still available for all beneficial uses. We shouldn't be protecting it for just the shallow, inefficient uses of today. Maybe tomorrow, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, they're not going to have any choice. They're going to have to go deeper because that's where the water is. And we need to make sure that we're protecting that resource so that it is there. And so I'm just asking the question, and I don't have an answer, John. I'm just trying to look at this thing from a lot of different points of view. And I'm thinking if we just rely on historical and what we've done with the, shallow, inefficient domestic wells, and, how does that really translate into the future? Do we just say, well, what has been will continue to be, or do we try to come up with a different approach? I'm just asking the question, that's all. I don't have an answer.
Well, let me, there's a couple of hands up now. Let me just try and, I don't know that we're going to be able to put a bow on this right now, but let me just ask Liz, is there anything from a technical position and given your knowledge of the basin that would, support Walt's line of questioning or theory about where we should set those minimum thresholds?
Yeah, so I think, the point you're making, Walt, is true. In the East, we have a huge bathtub of water, of groundwater, huge. I mean, we know that fresh water is very deep and there's a lot of it, right? But I think the question is that the subbasin needs to think about is if you continue to lower water levels, do you cause undesirable results in the subbasin? Are there going to be adverse impacts? And I think a couple of things come to mind. One is how deep are the wells, both the irrigation wells and domestic wells? And because you don't want to, you have to think about trying to avoid dewatering those, right? You don't want those wells to go dry. Also, if you continue to lower water levels, at what point will that affect the rivers? If the, regionally, the groundwater levels continue to decline, at some point, it's going to have an effect on the rivers, right? Where water levels decline below the base of the rivers. And so you would be losing water from the rivers to the groundwater table. So those are just a couple things to think about. And I don't have answers for you right now about, how deep can we go before wells are dry, both irrigation and domestic? How deep? I don't know how deep we can go before, we start to see more, impacts to the rivers. I think some modeling that's going to be done in the next couple of months will help us really understand this. I mean, the model is just going to be a great tool for us to help us understand these dynamics.
Yeah, I'm beginning to see what you're saying. And so, we might be able to define, a physical aquifer system of this big saturated thickness and these stratigraphy and all that. But then when we begin to apply Sigma and the GSA, the GSP constraints about avoiding undesirable results, we begin to define the limiting factors, right? And each of the 6 different undesirable results will have different MTs and MOs, and probably one of them will become a controlling limiting factor. And in many cases, I think it's this one, this chronic lowering of water levels. I just would hate to, from the get-go, this very first GSP, we inadvertently cut our feet off for the future, without knowing that we did. I'm just trying to keep my mind open, that's all.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I think the modeling, as Liz alludes to, will be that's forthcoming, will be interesting. So I'm going to pause there. Amanda with DWR, go ahead.
Okay, I think Walt actually kind of touched on the first question I had. I had all similar questions about whether the historic low is really showing adverse impacts, or is it just like a policy where if you don't go below the historic low, then you're essentially preventing future potential adverse impacts. But after hearing the response, I think my question was kind of answered. But I would add, in addition to the two things that you can think about, is the third would be potentially, the lower you go, water quality changes. And then the costs, also like economic impacts, the cost to deepen wells and extract wells at a deeper depth would be something other subbasins have considered with this, setting their minimum thresholds for this indicator. But I kind of wanted to, and I hate asking because I feel like you guys probably did this already, but did you guys define the undesirable result for chronic lowering of groundwater levels? I haven't heard that yet.
I don't think we have quite set on that yet.
Okay. Because that kind of would help. But one thing I wanted to mention from a department kind of standpoint, what I've heard in some of the conversations, is to remind you guys that in this first groundwater sustainability plan, an exceedance of a minimum threshold is not necessarily an automatic kind of failure. There's going to be, and there is anticipation to have exceedances. Your data is really going to show, your monitoring data as you collect it for these specific representative monitoring wells are really going to show your progress towards achieving sustainability. But this is your implementation phase and period, this next 20 years. So there's flexibility. So don't just run in assuming it has to be perfect right now. There is opportunity every 5 years when you do your 5-year update to change things, and you can change your minimum thresholds. In fact, I would be surprised if a basin didn't change theirs. Just moving forward, especially on as you get gain more understanding, you fill those data gaps. You might see that. So I kind of want to mention that, just remind you guys about that again. But I really wanted to know about the 4 wells that you have screened in both the upper and lower aquifers. I kind of want to understand, what is that actually going to show you? It doesn't sound like you have any just screened in the lower aquifer.
That's right. I think we are, the subbasin does have monitoring wells that are screened below the Corcoran. The city of Modesto installed some monitoring wells a couple of years ago that have screens both above and below Corcoran. And the program that we're doing now with the Prop 68 funding includes wells in the west within the Corcoran. And at each of those locations, we plan to construct a well both above and below the Corcoran. So we will have wells that are screened both above and below Corcoran. I don't have very good wells. I mean, the subbasin doesn't have monitoring wells right now with historical data that are screened below the Corcoran. So that's why I'm illustrating the water levels from these CASGEM wells, because I just don't have that. But we will have a monitoring network that has quite a few really good monitoring wells that are screened below the Corcoran that we'll be using to monitor in the future. And they certainly will be part of our monitoring network.
Plus, I think it indicates there's very little sub-Corcoran usage on the west side of the basin.
But we don't necessarily have the data to support that, do we?
No, do you mean, well, are you saying that there's not a lot of pumping going on below the Corcoran, or?
Most of the wells in the western basin are completed above the Corcoran, and they're provided for not so much water supply, but water table control, because the water is so shallow to the root zone.
Well,
And
when you look at
topo maps of this part of California, that entire area of the basin shows up as a swamp.
I think that's generally true, Walt, for the well. I mean, and Liz, correct me if I'm wrong, for the wells that we're currently monitoring now, right? I mean, those dots that you see in the west, it's true, Walt, and you know this, given your background, that those are shallow drainage wells where we're dewatering the root zone to be able to grow crops. But I think the question is, there certainly have to be wells out there that are below that shallow aquifer, and we just don't have the data to support, and have a good understanding of what's happening on the west side below the Corcoran.
That's true, but I think there's enough indications that probably tell us it's not unreasonable to assume that there's not a lot of deeper Corcoran usage on the west side of the Modesto Basin. When you get on the other side of the San Joaquin, that's not so true. There's more deeper confined aquifer groundwater extractions occurring, but I'm not so sure. I mean, look at the land use on the west side of our basin and think of the water supply to meet that land use. And most of the wells that we do know are shallow. And I don't think there's hidden deeper wells that are, well, I don't know that, and you're right. But anyway.
If you would like, I just pulled up cross section that we have in our GSP. If you'd like, I can share it with you because it has.
Let me before we do that, and we get too far down this path, let me just go to the last hand, which is raised, and then I'll let you, Liz, circle back, and that's Valerie Kincaid.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
We can.
Yes. Hi.
A lot of this was already said, but I just kind of want to maybe say it and tie in Amanda and Walt and Liz's points, which is that if we haven't chosen a metric for undesirable results yet, which I don't think we have, then it's not only the metric, but how the data affects that metric. And for just kind of a quick example, if the metric is domestic wells going dry, if you have 100 domestic wells and only 10 of them are very, very shallow and very, very old and need to be replaced, I think Walt's point is your undesirable results shouldn't be driven by that 10% of those kind of very vulnerable with any metric kind of wells. So part of it is that you have to look at the metric, which is, are you basing this on domestic wells, ag wells going dry, or just elevations because of other indicators, whether that's interconnected supplies or whether water quality happens. So you have to kind of pick a metric for undesirable results before you really, and I know that Liz was just using these MTs as examples, and I know she wasn't trying to set them, but really the MT should be driven by what that metric is and then the data around that metric. You could have a lot of different data. If you wanted to talk about domestic wells going dry and they're all relatively the same depth and quality, then that would be different than if they're hugely varied and you want to be protective of every well. So those are things that this basin is going to have to talk about and really have to define. That's the hardest part, I think, of SGMA. So that will hopefully drive the MT discussion at a later date, but you have to pick, what is an undesirable result for groundwater elevations, and then when you're likely to see those. And usually the MT drives when you're likely to see those, and that's based on the facts surrounding the metric, if that makes any sense. So
yeah, it does. No, it does, Valerie. I think those are all very, very good points. Liz, I don't see any other hands up from the public. Liz, did you want to circle back now with the figure that you had?
Yeah, I'll just move this over. Can you see that cross section now, John?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so this is a cross section in our GSP. This runs, I'll flip back so you can see where this line is. So this is A to A prime. It runs right through kind of approximately the center of the subbasin. So this shows where the Corcoran clay is and how it dips from east to west and kind of gets deeper elevation. And it also shows the wells that are along this transect. And this is only one transect. This is not indicative of the entire western principal aquifers. But what we can see here is that, Walt is right. Most of the wells in the west are screened, are completed above the Corcoran. But there are wells here that are screened below the Corcoran. And then, so we do know that there is some pumping that's happening below the Corcoran. And we see that in the response to those wells because, we know just because it's a confined aquifer, it takes less pumping to induce a change in potentiometric surface of the water level that you're seeing on those hydrographs. So there is pumping that is below the Corcoran. But I think your point is well taken, Walt, that most of the wells that are in the west are shallow in the upper aquifer.
Thank you, Liz. Steve, go ahead.
Sorry, John, I didn't know you called for comments from the public. One of the things that in establishing a metric, I think, is the cost of the pumping for the groundwater. So the last time I did the run, it cost about 50 cents of energy to lift an acre foot, 1 foot. So, you know, if you're obviously at 100 feet below the ground, you want to lift that water up, it's going to cost you $50 an acre foot. So every increment of lowering that adds cost to not only the water, but the operator of the well that's trying to use that well for a purpose. The pulse cell system today, if you look back at 2006, the energy to run that well costs us 138% more than it did today than it did back then in 2006. But I think you need to look at energy costs, and I don't want to sound like I'm not a professor, but this sounds like a professor. To replace that 50 cents of energy, you're going to have to go find a replacement energy for, I mean, you're going to have to go make that energy somewhere. And that in itself has costs that, I don't know, probably need to be thought about as we set these limits. Thank you.
That's a good point, Steve. Really good point.
Yeah, and I think this also relates to what Amanda said earlier about evaluating the economic impacts of deepening wells or installing new wells. This all plays into that equation.
Well, this has been a really good discussion. Okay, Liz, I think you have a few more slides.
I do. So this is it. So next steps. Like I said earlier, we're going to continue talking about sustainable management criteria now through the next couple of months, including the lowering of water levels, which we discussed today. And there'll be ongoing modeling analyses, the climate change, the sustainable yield runs, which I mentioned earlier. And then when we get past the sustainable management criteria, we're going to start working on the projects and management actions. So this is the roadmap for us over the next few months.
Thank you, Liz, for your presentation today. Are there any additional questions now that we've advanced one whole slide? I'll give the member agencies a first shot. Any questions for Liz, guys and gals?
Hey, Liz, this is Mike from Waterford. Can I get just a little brief message that I can get out on our Facebook page regarding those wells that are going to be built here in Waterford, so I can just get it out there so they see it happening. They understand that it's part of the groundwater management, so they understand kind of what we're trying to accomplish there.
Sure, I'll send you an email after this meeting.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, Mike, if you have any questions, we're obviously at MID happy to help you as well.
Sounds good. Thank you.
You bet. Okay, any additional questions for Liz from members of the public? Okay, seeing none. Thank you, Liz, for the presentation today. And we'll see both you and Phyllis, I'm assuming, at next month's meeting, which brings us to item number 5 on the agenda for today, which is our next meeting. And that is scheduled for April the 14th at 2 p.m. Again, immediately following the standing monthly meeting of the GSA. Any items too late for the agenda today? Okay, seeing none, thank you everyone for your participation today. It was a good discussion, and we'll look forward to seeing you all next month.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Take care.